Welcome to JF with Daniel. I'm your host, Rabbi Daniel Levine. Today we are here with Lauren Merlino, a biologist here at UC Irvine, also a Jewish member of the LGBT community. Lauren, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. I'm so excited to be here.
So I think we found the one topic that's more controversial than the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which is the wider conversation about LGBTQ and specifically trans identity. You know, just since the election, I was looking it up, there was a Democratic congressman, I think from Massachusetts, that was saying that one of the reasons why the Democrats lost was because they sort of went a little bit more extreme on the trans issue. I know we'll sort of unpack a lot of the background, but I'm curious. I mean, when you see trans identity getting caught up in all these culture wars, from your vantage point, both as a member of the LGBT community and also your vantage point of somebody who actually studies this from a biological perspective as opposed to everybody else that just, you know, sits on Twitter and, you know, plays armchair biologist. I mean, what are your thoughts of this becoming one of the defining culture wars of our time?
What a great question. So I, unsurprisingly, have very mixed thoughts. For starters, I'll introduce and let the audience know I identify as non-binary. I don't necessarily identify as trans, but we fit into kind of an umbrella together. The trans and non-binary are under this umbrella. Some people who are non-binary identify as trans, some don't. It's kind of a individual decision. But from my vantage point and in my lived experiences, I struggle with both narratives coming from the far left and both the narratives coming from the far right. So when people make these claims that LGBTQ, whether you're talking about just lesbian, gay relationships, or you're talking about trans issues, or we're even talking about people who are intersex, which may actually be separate from LGBTQ, depending, again, on who you ask. It is biologically not correct to say there are two sexes, they're evenly defined, and they fit perfectly neatly into a little box. That is, in fact, garbage.
So you're saying, just to, you know, I guess translate that into non-science speak for, you know, both myself and the listeners, right? There tends to be this idea on the right where whenever they're, you know, coming into contact with trans identity, basically say, that's foolish in nature, there's only two genders or two sexes, there's male and female, this is all just sort of either made up or some sort of mental disorder, and you're saying that that's not even necessarily true when we're talking about, I don't know, pick our favorite, you know, animal.
It's not necessarily true in animals or in people. So, you know, when we are in utero, there's a process called sex determination. And it is not as simple as saying, I have an XX chromosome and you have XY. Therefore, you are for sure going to be in every aspect male, and I am going to for sure be in every aspect female. That is what we've been told, and it's because it's an easy, simple story. And there's a lot of nuanced biology behind this, but I'll break it down as non-sciencey as I can get. Your chromosome we are all default have a female template. And if you have an XY chromosome, there's levels of sex determination. They happen chromosomally, so that's within your cell. They happen gonadally. This is testes versus ovaries. And then there's genital sex and hormonal sex. So you have, within the framework of biology, this is not new agey, this is not DEI influenced. This is, you will find this in textbooks from the 60s, okay? This is basic biology.
You know they had their science correct in the 60s.
I mean, obviously. And it's actually, there has been an evolution of these both of terms and of how we talk about things. But sex is nuanced. Whether your genes code for you to have a change in your gonads, you have to develop your gonads before you can create these masculinized body parts. And these happen sequentially. Now, the reason this matters is because if any step in this process that I haven't gone into immense detail because it's too much.
Listeners can Google a YouTube video of this.
You can Google quite a bit about this. But if any step in this process gets interrupted by anything from external hormones to gene change to, you know, something happening in utero from your mother, you can have what is considered a masculinized or feminized end result.
So you're talking about sex, not gender.
Correct.
So I think that's an interesting place to start, because usually if you were to talk to, say, a trans activist, what they would say is that sex might be binary, but gender has nothing to do with sex, and gender is a full spectrum. And so one of the interesting things, you seem to be kind of complicating both. You seem to be saying sex is not always binary. I mean, would you agree that it's bimodal in terms of, let's say 49% female, 49% male, and then a little bit in the middle? Or would you say it's more of a spectrum on that?
You could make an argument that it's bimodal, but it's not as bimodal as you just suggested.
Okay.
And you are correct. I am complicating the picture because that's what a good biologist does. But I would say, so the estimates online tend to guess that the intersex population is about as common as redheadedness.
And this is in humans?
In humans. Once you get to other animals, different things happen. And I can't remember off the top of my head how common redheadedness is. I think it's like 4 or 5%. So it's probably like 48 and 48. Now, this is from the definition of intersex that we have, which is a little more rigid than perhaps what I might call masculinized or feminized in an animal. So intersex definitions in medicine tend to be you have gonads, genitals, or chromosomes that are somehow mismatched, one or the other, and it could be in any combination. And many intersex people live their life, and you would never know, and many of them actually don't identify at all with the LGBTQ community.
And many of them, at least if I'm remembering this correctly from, the couple evolutionary biology classes I took in college, we're talking about a long time ago, intersex, the person might not even ever know.
100%.
Unless there's something interesting down the road, maybe when they want to reproduce or something like that. So what you're talking about now is a very different thing than when we're talking about gender identity and that being a spectrum, right?
It is.
It's obviously connected in some way, but you're essentially, just to kind of, summarize everything, correct me if I'm wrong, the sort of right-wing knee-jerk reaction of course, it's just male and female, that's biology, progressives have lost their mind. That's not entirely scientifically accurate because, biologically that's not. Okay, so let's move over to sort of the far left. You said you don't agree with how the far left categorizes this. What would be your main criticism of that?
So, my biggest concern on the far left, and this is unique a little bit to the United States because the European countries have made different recommendations, but I think the blanket statement that that puberty blockers are completely safe and are in the extreme. You have people that would argue that they are necessary and important. I think is too far of a statement. I am not necessarily saying that puberty blockers should be banned, but blocking puberty has severe consequences, some of which are known and some of which are unknown. It can change everything from brain and bone development, and its long-term effects can, you could end up becoming infertile from it.
So let's even step back, because obviously puberty blockers is one of the, tentacles of this wider culture war, but more fundamentally, I guess, and, I have no dog in this fight, just for full disclosure, I'm very interested in it because, in undergrad I studied cognitive science. The classes I found most interesting were the evolutionary psychology classes that, from some perspective, all evolutionary psychology is predicated on a gender binary. Just for people at home, maybe that's a little bit, overly simplistic, but the whole thing is, what are the sexual selection traits in males versus females across the animal kingdom. So I also took a couple gender studies classes in undergrad because I was, curious and had some GEs, so I took it. And it was just such an interesting and astonishing situation how it seemed like those two fields had never talked to each other. It seemed like gender studies had never met a biologist and biologists had never talked to gender studies. And so I've just been on, I just find this one of the most interesting contemporary issues. It seems to be that there is a lot more people now in 2024 identifying as trans than virtually at any other point in human history. Now, there's sort of two dominant explanations, and of course it doesn't have to be, no pun intended, it doesn't have to be a binary of which choice is correct, right? Option number one is sort of the same argument that was used in the gay rights movement, which is there's always a baseline percentage of people in the population that, let's take a less controversial example. My one goal is to produce an interesting podcast. The second is for me not to lose my job here, which we'll talk about at the end. Why this, it's so hard to have these even basic conversations.
Yes.
Left-handedness, right? Hopefully nobody, in the left-handed rights community will get offended, right? Left-handedness was maligned throughout history. Actually,
yes.
There's actually one story in the Tanakh, the Hebrew Bible, that talks about left-handedness, and it's very interesting because one of the, there's a very minor story, but, I always go on tangents here. It's more fun to go on tangents when we're in person here. I'll let you drink your coffee. One of the judges was a left-handed guy. He was actually described as having a withered right arm, but that was actually, most historians think that actually is just a way of, saying left-handed, but it was a little bit of a slur. It's like, instead of saying, oh, you're a lefty, it's like, oh, you have a withered right arm. But he was actually able to sneak into the palace and kill the king, Eglon, who was, I believe, the king of Moab, but I haven't read the story in a very long time. Listeners can fact-check me at home, because most people obviously have their dagger, in their left, so they can pull it out like this. I can use my pen as illustration here. But he obviously, as a lefty, had his dagger there, and I guess whatever the TSA of the, Iron Age didn't check his thing. But the argument with left-handedness is, once we obviously got over the foolish dislike of left-handedness, then the baseline population, I don't think we're producing new left-handed people now. So the argument was roughly the same with the gay and lesbian community. It seems like now that's basically accepted within the scientific community, somewhere between 5 and 10%, again, depending on exactly, who you're asking or what statistics you're reading. Fine. So one argument about the trans community is that it's the same thing, right? It was always, I'll give a number, 8 to 9% of, young, especially girls, because, it tends to be a lot more girls who are, trans boys, right? Girls who then identify as boys.
Right.
Trans boys. So the number of trans boys was always in 7 to 8% of the population, just it was always maligned historically, and now all of a sudden that the, societal pressure's off, now it's the true nature. The other argument on the flip side is that this is all just society, either a social contagion or some sort of mental illness that's going on there, right? That seems to be the right and left. I'm curious, because this is a lot more fundamental to then the conversation of puberty blockers. I mean, what do you think about those two arguments? Do you think they're mutually exclusive? I mean, if somebody just asked you that, thoughts?
So before I completely answer, I'm gonna tell a story.
Perfect.
So within the gay and lesbian rights, okay, so as we talked about, it used to be that people never knew anyone who was queer or gay, and then, people said, like you just said, we were always here, we just didn't know, there's always a baseline population. But that cultural belief actually, shockingly, sorry, that was sarcasm for listeners, biased scientists in their observations. So it became this assumption that scientists who were studying mating behavior in animals, whenever they saw a copulatory pair, it was always assumed that the one on top was male and the one on bottom was female. And it wasn't until later that it became clear that that was in fact not correct, and that ranges from a quite, we're talking 1,500 animals now that we have realized display what would be called same-sex behavior.
And there's all sort of interesting, just because this is one of the things that fascinated me in undergrad when I was studying, cognitive science. There is good evolutionary, I don't want to say defense, but there's actually good evolutionary selection for this. You have, somebody who helps out, say, the entire nest as opposed to, just their own offspring, and, there's all these equations that are done, a nephew is 0.25 your evolutionary biology as opposed to a direct offspring, which is 0.5, so if you help enough nephews, it might actually make sense for certain people to not procreate, right? So
it's really fascinating. That would be what I would call a near recent anthropological evolutionary regard for why same-sex behavior might increase parental and overall family lineage. But it actually, the argument can go back way farther, that it's actually really simple. The ability for an organism to differentiate sexes almost certainly came second, not first. So it's likely that first organisms were willing to have sex with anything, and sometimes it worked and sometimes it didn't. And later they got better and better at identifying the organism that was going to have offspring.
That's interesting.
So it's not until recently that we've kind of realized that that line makes more sense in terms of evolutionary history, which is fascinating because it really turns the argument on its head from a what was natural or not.
There also is, I just want to point out for people listening and, are wondering, I mean, eventually we will get to Jewish stuff, I got to keep in line with the podcast, but this is sort of like one of my pet intellectual interests. There is a difference between being descriptive about nature and proscriptive, right? So there is a certain fallacy. I usually see this on the right, but I think the left uses it at times too, called the naturalistic fallacy, which is if you describe something as descriptive in nature, that's different than being normative. So,
Correct.
Just the most explicit example is rape is also ubiquitous within the animal kingdom. I mean, by definition, right? There's no, there isn't a lot of consent, right?
The only challenge with statements like that is, and this might be where you're going, it's difficult to define. There's absolutely an absence of clear consent from our point of view. However, rape is this human-defined law.
Well, that's exactly what I was getting at. Meaning, I don't think anybody who spends their day at the zoo watching or actually like what you do and actually go into where animals are really supposed to live, which is nature as opposed to the zoo, and watches a group of I don't know sea lions all day and watch the male sort of go from female to female. Describing that is very different than saying this is what humans should do. So
100%.
if you say that there is or isn't something in nature, that's a very different argument than saying this is a good model for humans. There is a type of natural law type argument. Thomas Aquinas was very big. I'll connect this to medieval philosophy a little bit. He's one of the fathers of what you might call natural law. Which is this idea, Maimonides gets into this a little bit, but not as forceful as Aquinas, which is basically saying that there is some objective morality and you can see it from the laws of nature. That argument seems very difficult because, you look at nature and it doesn't really seem like there's a clear rhyme or rhythm morally, right? There's evolutionary pressures, but, nobody would say it's good for, the biggest alpha male sea lion to have, 15 mates and the other 14 men to basically die off, which is essentially what at least I think in theory happens evolutionarily.
From a moral perspective or from a
moral.
Yeah.
Again,
it becomes
which is why the whole conversation is stupid. But anyway, getting back into I guess this is what happens when you stick two people with ADHD with 2 cups of coffee and no clear outline for our conversation, but me texting you saying we should discuss trans stuff. This is what happens. But okay, so centering us back for 1 second, this sort of question of trans identity now, is this something that does it make sense, the sort of argument of the trans activist community that
from both
that no, this is just clearly because societal norms have changed. How dare you say, it usually comes with a little bit of, how dare you say this has anything to do with either social media or mental health or earlier onset for puberty for young girls, right? Like there's all these things or social contagion, right?
Yes.
All these things the right brings up. The trans activist community usually says, that's transphobic. It's obvious that this is just their true selves and identity. So I'm curious to throw that to you.
So now that I told my story, my answer to that is yes. I think that you cannot, in fact, separate both culture and biology. And so I think that it is both true that we are influenced by whatever society that we live in, and that might make it safe for us to come out and show who we always knew we are. And if you're someone who, someone who would be considered, let's go, I'll say someone that was a woman that was always called a tomboy. Mm-hmm. Okay, I have experienced this, and I have many friends that have experienced this. And we don't like to talk about it that much because we don't want this to be used as an example to shut conversations down. That's not what this is. It's simply a statement that there are, in fact, times when people that present as tomboy now sometimes have felt pressure that people say, well, maybe you're trans. And sometimes that's true, and sometimes it's not.
Okay.
And so there is some societal effect. The degree that affects the whole picture is difficult to say, but what becomes interesting is when you look at the percent of people that identify trans per generational group. You know, it starts small and then it gets larger by the time that we get to Gen Z.
Yeah.
What's the most recent generation called?
Maybe Alpha. I think.
Alpha.
Gen Alpha.
Gen Alpha's levels, and again, the audience, please fact check me on this, but the last time that I looked at this, the levels of people that identify as trans in Gen Alpha actually dropped. Now, it's not lower than boomers, but there was a peak and a drop, which suggests,
it kind of seems like there also is now, 4 or 5 years ago, maybe even longer, maybe it was 10 years ago that sort of the trans movement began. Any questioning or pushback was immediately responded with, you're being a transphobe and a bigot. That conversation is clearly switching. The number of people, one of the reasons why I was so interested, one, I'll talk about anything, whatever, but the number of people who, behind closed doors, to friends of theirs I've heard this many times, all my friends know that I work on a campus, or even students who talk to me about cultural issues say, I don't understand this at all. It seems like, this is not my opinion, but I'll echo what I hear from, honestly, a lot of people that aren't in progressive circles. It seems like this is just like a mass mental health epidemic that we're just calling like a new identity, but they're too afraid to say anything. And so I think all of a sudden now, because the trans activist community has gone so far and so extreme in a whole variety of things. One, in terms of gender identity, but then also, we'll get to this in a couple of minutes, things like supporting Hamas now as like the trans activist world, then people have no problem. Like, all right, we have to have a serious conversation about this. Like, obviously there has to be some middle ground between there's two genders, and if you identify as anything but that, I'm gonna shame you and basically refuse to call you by your preferred pronouns, right?
And like prevent you from going to the bathroom.
Yeah, prevent you to go to the bathroom. Like, who cares at the end of the day? Like, I don't care. I'll call people. If someone tells me I don't like my first name and I'd rather you call me by this nickname, like, I'm not going to say, but your real name. It's like it's just not being a basic, good human being. On the other hand, this sort of, I'll call it, I think, fiction. You tell me if that's too strong of a word. That there's this thing called gender that has nothing to do with sex, that's clearly just a construct, which is sort of the edifice of Gender Studies 101, and, there's no actually, gender and gender differences are just completely a social construct, and, of course, everybody, everyone's a jump ball, right? So you're about to have a baby, and even when that baby comes out, whatever their, biology is, it's still a jump ball 50-50 on what their gender is, right? Like, that also doesn't seem reasonable also, so where's that middle ground?
Okay, so I have two comments, and I'm going to say them out loud so I don't forget the second one.
Perfect.
The first one, I want to just talk a little bit and validate the nuance of balancing struggles for the trans community.
I could give you a piece of paper if you would like to, potentially. Let's do that. This is
the second one is going to be about the nature of the nuance of what the word gender.
We have Rainier trying to pop in with the paper also.
Rainier has opinions.
Rainier has strong opinions.
But so the second part, I do want to talk about gender, and I specifically want to bring in an endocrinology perspective with this concept of behavior and hormones and behavior. Okay, but let me just back up a second. I do want to acknowledge that I think that people, if you're in the non-binary and trans community, many of us are predisposed to levels of trauma from the society, from society in general. And, when you bring up a mental health problem, there's interesting arguments that suggest that, well, most of the issues that the trans community faces are the result of society. I think it's probably a mix, because even without society, feeling a level of dysphoria in your own body is always difficult, whether it's about your genitals or other sex characteristics, or whether it's because you think you're really fat when you're skinny, or vice versa. Dysphoria is painful. Now, as we've created space to try to create a society that can encompass, all the ways that humans can be, it's become difficult. And on the right, the real difficulty when you talk about bathrooms is that no matter what the right says, if you have someone who's trans and non-binary, they get yelled at best, attacked, or harassed no matter what bathroom they go to. So this solution that you force them to go into their sex-appropriate bathroom is a no-win situation. Now, this has led to what I would observe in the LGBT community as, at times, stances that I think are meant to adamantly support the trans community, but don't always in practice do that. And that's where I, as a scientist, kind of wonder about evidence-based practices, right? Does what we're doing lead to the result that we want? And the truth is there are some situations where we don't know. And that's where I come back to like puberty blockers in my mind. Okay, puberty blockers, for me, as with my background in endocrinology and what I know about physiology of the human body, I think that parents need to be making informed decisions on that. When it comes to societal things, I think it's very difficult to say. We have a lot of people in the non-binary community could care less about gender. I myself sometimes operate in that zone. What do you mean by care less about gender? I mean, I identify they, she. I'm non-binary. I don't use male pronouns. I've mispronounced myself. I feel like I fit in different spaces. I don't strongly identify one way or another. I don't feel like I need women, male or female spaces in my life. These are not concepts I think about regularly. Now, the reason I bring this up though is because just because we feel that way, it's important to recognize that that is not true for quite a lot of people. For many women, they deeply identify with their womanhood as being female. They deeply identify with the ability to bear children as expressing their womanhood. And that is okay. And in the queer community, sometimes we just want to throw it all out. And as a society, I don't think that's where the majority of us are at. So this is kind of looping me back into this conversation of gender, which I think is societal, and I can't. It's very difficult to talk about the biological components of it, but this is the nuance that I'm going to bring to it.
But it seems like from an evolutionary, at least psychology perspective, gender is mostly just it's almost like the phenotype of how you act given your biology to some extent. So like if genes are to phenotype as is gender is to sex in most cases. Now it doesn't mean there isn't a wide spectrum. So you're gonna have you're gonna have men that are more genderly feminine and women who are more genderly masculine, and then maybe even sometimes where again that bimodal things that aren't operating in that. But to say something like most on average, because this is always where I think, the more scientific thinking comes in. If somebody were to say, on average, men are more aggressive than women, that is a gender comment. Most people would say that's just intuitively true. I see you a little bit wavering, so I would love to hear your thoughts. And is that a question about biology? Is that a question about gender?
Yeah.
Is that
So no, 100%. So and it's a perfect segue into point number 2 from 15 minutes ago, which is we often think of hormones as these things in our body that control behavior. So people think I have high testosterone, therefore I'm going to be more aggressive. Now there is of course truth to the fact that testosterone can increase aggression, but there is not truth to say that testosterone always increases aggression.
Of course.
And what's really interesting, and a comment that is almost never talked about, is that hormones and behavior are bi-directional, which is to say that behavior can also change your hormones. Okay, so we live in this deep cyclical world where the behaviors that we have impact the hormones and the hormones impact the behaviors. And you see this over generations and millennia. And there is no question that there is broad sexual dimorphism, which would be to say that males and females have, biologically, men and women, males and females, men and... See, I get confused now which one's gender and which one's sex.
You're canceled. Canceled.
I know, yeah, sorry. So males and females have sexually dimorphic characteristics.
Yes.
And that is true. And like everything, it's on a bell curve. Now, the issue, though, is when we start talking about things evolutionarily, especially in humans, there's other layers about. And one of them is, frankly, the evolutionary pressure on humans is rather low. Nowadays, yes. And that's not to make any comment on the evolutionary rationale of anything. It's just, whether gender led to a role in different societies is a really interesting comment. But it comes back to the same comment.
But it seems sort of obvious that that's true. And so let me try to, and I'm not making a modern point. I'm making more historical or anthropological.
That's great. I will counter it because I'm ready.
Yes, perfect. This is fun. The listeners are probably annoyed. Why are they not? Okay, so we know, just to set, the facts, and let me know if you don't think these are facts. Men have much lower evolutionary cost for mating, right? It takes about 10 minutes in between, a biological male to be able to reproduce again.
Of course.
Maybe 25 minutes, and, and it takes about a year for an average female. And so, on average, men are going to be able to, each time having sex is a lower cost in terms of, for a woman. So, on average, that's going to lead to selection pressures where women are going to be more careful with who they mate with than men because of these different pressures. Because for a woman, it's a year lost, and for a man, it's, 30 minutes lost. Because men can reproduce so often, that's going to lead to pressure, and females then are, the very limited, again, this is purely evolutionary descriptive, not normative, because women are sort of like the commodity of, if you don't get to this woman, some other man will, and then she's not going to be able to bear a kid for another year. That's going to lead to more aggression among men, and it's going to lead to a sexual selection of survival of the fittest, where only the strongest men are selected for, because if, I'm the strongest guy in the tribe, I can just simply push my way and dominate more females. So over time, men are going to select for more aggressive things, and women are going to select for more being able to be a lot higher, have a lot higher EQ, right? Being able to read people's emotions, being able to catch liars, obviously an evolutionary predisposition, correct, again, at any point if I disagree, throw it on the gauntlet. But let me finish telling you at least what I believe to be the historical narrative, and then you can tell me if you disagree with. This is going to lead to traits that are more common among women, like, gossip, which evolutionarily is if a guy is a cheat and you don't think that guy is actually going to provide for the offspring, and the second he impregnates you, he's just going to leave. That's very important information for a woman to tell another woman, because you're going to risk a whole year of your, again, all of evolution, just for listeners that, don't remember this since high school biology class, evolution is just about reproduction, just about sex. And, at the end of the day, this is what selects for genes, the genes that can reproduce, live on. There was some better rhyme for that, I remember, in high school.
I don't know the rhymes.
So just to finish the story, and then you can complicate it, because at least this is what I think the baseline view of people that want to understand this from a historical or scientific perspective are coming out with, and I would love to have this complicated. That, of course, given hundreds of thousands of years of course, evolution from, apes to Neanderthals to, wherever we come from, Homo sapiens to humans, whatever, is going to lead for, on average, hundreds of thousands of years of men selecting to be more aggressive, women selecting to be more, they think things like, emotion is a lot more important. Then, when you start to slowly evolve into, hunter-gatherers and then modern societies, on average, the men are going to be better hunters because they've quite literally selected themselves.
Okay, now I'm going to interrupt.
Complicate.
So, there's actually a really fantastic article called Man the Hunter and reviewing that as knowledge.
Okay.
So I'm gonna heavily focus on hunter-gatherer.
Okay.
Because but I will, before I get into that, I'll just say that I think a lot of the things that you have described are going to be highly dependent on the society that they're in. So sometimes when we talk about human evolution, we talk about it so broadly that we're not really appreciating these various subgroups that have existed over time that in fact have distinct differences. But so this concept of man the hunter and woman the gatherer posits that in ancient times when you had Neanderthals, that the men were stronger and hunted, and because women were gossipy, fragile, whatever reason you want to come by,
but not even fragile,
because they could get pregnant.
Not even attributing moralizing to this again, because this is where I think the right kind of goes off the deep end, where they create a moral story here. Just more biological women just don't have the same pressure to be bigger and stronger and more aggressive, and so it's not that they're more fragile, they just have had different selection pressures than...
Now, the thing to understand, though, about aggression in animals is that aggression is often the result of mating, as you described, not hunting. Okay? They're actually they can be very unique. So aggression is often, not always, there's territorial aggression, there's conspecific aggression, but a lot of aggression comes from males versus males vying for or courting another female. Now, but in this hunter-gatherer paradigm, I forgot the guy's name who popularized this. He called it man the hunter, and it was a popularized concept in recent history, as in like the 1940s, 50s, 60s, somewhere in that era. And for them to publish that data, they had to actually ignore other data that contradicted it. And similar to what I argued about the evolution of homosexuality, where the ability to distinguish between sexes almost certainly came after the separation and division of labor almost certainly also came after. The evidence that we have from Neanderthals, biologically, anthropologically, both from everything from culture and burials to the biological structure of bodies, suggests that these nomads did not have the luxury of separating privileges. Literally everyone was hunting. Everyone was gathering, whether you were pregnant, whether you weren't. And you see this in modern tribes, and that this mixed roles. And you see this in everything from burial sites. There was no separation of burial sites. You see this from repeated injuries that look the same on both sexes. Clearly both were throwing spears. And now there's clearly also biological differences.
But just even in that, and I don't mean to say this
no, go ahead.
facetiously, but given what we know about certain, exactly as you said before, the different sexual selection pressures on men and women back, or I'll say males on females, because let's even assume this is before anything we'd call humans. You see this among, apes also, where the men are bigger, the males are bigger than the females. Even if they were all hunting, the men are going to be able to throw the spears further on average, and that's not a social construct.
So I would probably agree with that. Now, there's this one of the articles I'm thinking, I'm pretty sure it's in Scientific America. It actually breaks down the biologies. There's no question that when it comes to brute strength and the ability to lift and or throw, males, by and large, win in that regard. Now, what's interesting, though, is when it comes to ultra-endurance running, women take that crown. And it's that leads to this question, well, why don't we see that in races? And you only actually will see that in the data of races of ultra-endurance running. So the marathon is not an ultra-endurance
Yeah, there was a book a couple years ago called Born to Run, which is about a journalist who joins some Mexican tribe that does these insanely long distance runs. I highly recommend it to anybody who's remotely interested in running.
Yeah.
And he talks about these, ultra marathons and 50, 75, 100 miles. And he talks about how the gender gap, let's compare it with sprinting, where sprinting is the opposite, right?
Exactly.
Men have such an, advantage over women,
You can get it even to the muscle fibers, how this works. Everything from muscle fibers to metabolic uptake to protective effects of estrogen, okay? So there is a lot of layers, but yes.
Mm-hmm. And even that, right, to say, so let's go with, I think long distance swimming is also generally females do a lot better than males in humans.
Probably, I don't know.
But that still would be rooted in biology, not social construct.
Correct.
So either way you dice it. So it seems like the reason why, at least according to, I think what makes sense according to evolution, but again, you're the scientist here, I'm just the person who took some courses in undergrad and finds this topic endlessly fascinating. Endlessly fascinating. You know, I've also read the book of Genesis. I don't know if that fits in here. A little bit. Listen,
it does.
The story of Garden of Eden has been interpreted as going from a hunter-gatherer to a agrarian society. You know, Cain and Abel fit in very well with that.
Yes, it does.
We talked about that in class. You popped into my class a couple weeks ago for that lecture, so I'm happy you came. I completely forgot where I was going. Oh, here's where I was going. Much of the gender role differences that you see now, again, descriptively, not normatively, seem to just be a natural reflection of honing of hundreds of thousands of years of evolution that then end up creating the traditional, even patriarchal structures that you see in society today. Now, that's very different than saying that should continue to happen, because you can say a similar thing for hierarchical power structures among humans also, right? Like, it is rational evolutionary in some sense. If I have all the power in the world for me to just endlessly treat everybody terrible, nobody would ever say, therefore, right now I should amass as much power as I can and treat everyone terribly. But the idea that, you know, say, on average, men are better than women at basketball, or on average, there's going to be a higher percentage of women who are in, you know, the mental health counseling field, right? To say those things.
Well, I'm actually going to cut you off here. So, that's a great example. So, when it comes to the mental health field, I think it's an example counter to your point of how rapidly gender roles are changing. If you go back 100 years, women were not considered capable of being doctors. They were not considered capable of being able to mentally take care of it. Like,
but that's clearly sexism, right? Like, so here's more of the argument, right? Like,
was it at the time though? Like,
yeah, sexism is sexism regardless of where it comes from, right? So this is more the argument. The reason why sexism existed 100 years ago, to the point where people thought women couldn't be doctors, is also rooted in probably evolutionary biology. Again, that's a bad thing, right? Like, we want to change that as society going to, right? We don't want to be shackled by evolution. I think, you know, the entire purpose of morals and religion, you know, is overcoming our animalistic nature. And so, you know, I can't stress this any more strongly. Saying something is not saying something ought to be, right? That's the 100%. David Hume distinction. So I'll say it over and over again, right? The whole reason why I'm a religious person and is because I specifically don't want to be animalistic. So 100 years ago, of course you have a bunch of men in charge because of evolutionary, you know, men just have more power. So on average, you know, if it's a zero-sum power game, you know, men are going to be more in charge and say, no, sorry, you can't play. You know, the same reason why 100 years ago there weren't a lot of black people in the MLB. It's not because black people were worse at baseball. It's because they had a separate league for black people. Then once the guardrails are lifted off, and once, you know, okay, now the medical field, you know, there still is some sexism in the medical field, but now that the medical field is mostly, you know, you can do it if you're a man, woman, you know, whatever, you're going to see that trend of, you know, orthopedic surgeons or, you know, physicists are going to trend towards men, and, you know, mental health counselors, psychiatrists, OB-GYN doctors, right, are going to trend towards women. It's not saying that has to be. It's not saying if a man wants to be a OB-GYN, you know, you shun them, but just saying like that, it seems like the evolutionary history just shapes, you know, again, these are all bell curves, but on average the bell curve is just a little bit off. But the same as everywhere, right? Like, there are a lot of women that can kick my butt at basketball, right? Because that's
sure.
always a rejoinder.
Everything is
the answer is, you're never going to find a woman that's going to be able to be the top 100 basketball players in the world, which, you know, seems like it's true, you know.
I mean, never is a strong word.
Never is a strong word.
Basketball rules from male and female are different also. But, male and female divisions. But I struggle a little bit with the argument that biology determines gender because, to be clear, I do think that there are, we can clearly look at data, demographic data, that shows there are more women in this and there are more men in that, and, there are more men who are firefighters and all these things. But the biology to support that is controversial at best. And it's almost impossible to parse it out from society. And for every society that you see doing one way, in many, there's often societies that do the opposite. And, there's clearly still predominant themes, but biologically it's difficult to make these arguments strongly. And I find that this is where people on the far right go wrong. They make their arguments in the name of biology, and biology doesn't really have a lot to say about gender. I mean, it's not zero, it's not nothing. I wouldn't say it's completely separate from sex, especially in that your gender identity can also influence your physiology.
Of course.
There's interesting studies that show various physiological characteristics from protein levels in your brain. So specific proteins, not all proteins, and other markers. When you divide by sex, you see two distinct phenotypes, and then when you look at someone who's non-binary, they actually tend to be they tend to be the ones leaning differently, and that's this natural variation that exists within biology. And so I'm always a fan of leaning into the natural variation and diversity that we see. And there is, of course, these
But I don't think those are mutually... So let's say...
Probably not.
Because I think the argument only needs to be, right? So everything's a bell curve.
Everything is a bell curve.
When we're talking about this, right? If listeners take one thing and, from our 45-minute conversation about evolution, everything is a bell curve. And what I mean by that, and, I assume you would agree with this, is that when we're talking about proficiency or success or, non-success in anything, there's going to be a bell curve when talking about averages. So one can say, on average, I'll just use the basketball example because, if I'm going to get canceled, I'll get canceled on one example. I won't give them 6 examples to cut from this podcast, right? On average, men are better than women at basketball. On average, men are, let's even give them more innocuous. On average, men are taller than women, right?
That's easy for me.
That is easy.
Basketball's too
right?
subjective.
Sure, but basketball happens to be that being tall helps you play basketball.
Yes,
and also speed, right?
Sure,
and men on average are faster at running the 100 meter dash.
Interestingly, the strategies in both basketball games are different, though, right? But it's related to that.
Yes. So on average, right, the bell curve of men, I don't know what it is, but it's taller than the bell curve of women. It doesn't mean, of course, that you're not going to have women that are taller than men. Everyone knows women that are taller than men. It just means that, on average, the average man is taller than the average woman, right? If you took the 3 or 4 billion men in the world and average that height, and the 4 billion women in the world and average that height, the men would be, 2 or 3 inches taller. And also on the wings, right, on the extreme, the tallest person in the world is going to be a man almost always. Almost always, right? And so the argument with, things in society are sort of go down a similar argument with, with basketball, if we assume, there's an equal bell curve, I would argue basketball is just a product of how fast you are, how tall you are, and how well your hand-eye coordination are, which, I mean, I'm sure there's, some strategy there also, but, no matter how many books I read, I'm never going to be able to be in the NBA.
Correct.
It was actually one of the fun thought experiments I like to have with my friends. Total non sequitur here is if you kept your current, age and body and you never aged and you lived forever, how many years of training do you think it would take for you to be able to get a starting role in the NBA? It's a really funny question, right? Could I don't know, if 500 years of training, of perfecting my three-point shot, of, being in the best shape in human history, would I ever be able to go in the NBA? I don't know. I don't think so. I probably wouldn't.
I feel similarly about myself.
Yeah, but it's an interesting question, right? And so I don't know why I brought that up, but if nothing else, then to give it... So I think that's more the argument, that society just reflects a lot of those. Now, it might be that it's a good thing to say, okay, basketball is sort of a dumb example because no society needs basketball, but society does need healthcare providers. And there's a lot of research showing that obviously, I think, females are more likely to acknowledge pain that females feel that men often overlook, right? There's a lot of, sexism in medical research, right? Historically, a lot of medical research has just been done using, what's the joke of psychology? The replication crisis, because all psychology experiments in the 20th century were like
middle-aged men.
Yeah, middle-aged men or college student men.
Yeah.
And so, okay, obviously that's the problem. And so it would be a good thing for there to be more diversity among medical researchers, especially around gender.
100%.
But that's different than saying, up until now, the reason why, let's say after the sort of, gates were open and after, there really isn't any societal barriers to women going into the same careers as men, the reason why you still see differences in a lot of cases could also be due to just historical innate differences rather than this field just being, I don't think it's the case that physics, that's an example that a lot of people pick on, which is very male heavy, or, theoretical mathematics. I don't think it's the case that they're just a bunch of raging sexists that don't let women in. It just happens to be that, on the tails of the guys who are really into physics, these, savant mathematical geniuses, it just tends to be that skews more men for whatever reason.
What I will tell you is of the colleagues and coworkers that I know in those fields that are female in very heavy male-dominated fields, it is brutal.
No, it's totally brutal.
And so that one is so hard to parse out for me because the social aspect of it is very real. I mean, walking into a 500-person conference and being one of 2 or 3 women is inherently not great to begin with, and it's even worse when no space and the whole space is designed to keep you out of it. Now,
but what do we mean? Okay, so let's unpack that only because. So I happen to, my dad is a physics professor. He's the head of the biophysics department at Northeastern, and just in conversations with him and his colleagues over the years, because of different diversity requirements, they actually a lot of times give affirmative action preferential treatment to women in those fields because they're such a low number. So a lot of the push is somebody saying, hey, why is the physics department made up of 15 men, and no women? So a lot of times, right, and so that, saying that on average of 100 new applicants are going to get for a professor, 95 are men, and so just on average, if you're just using merit, the men will get it. That's different than saying, okay, well, once the, 5% of women go to that conference, of course, there's probably a lot of sexism around, I think sexism is the most pervasive type of ism in society, precisely because, unlike race, a lot of these things are essentialized, right? Race is to some extent, and again, this is a whole other conversation, but race is a social construct.
Oh,
right?
Yes, biologically.
You look at the bones and the the phenotype and the genetic, right? It's it's made up, right?
There are in fact many differences in human cultures, but they do not fall in the same lines as racial categories.
Exactly, and so, but here, sex differences are essentialized, right? There are essential differences, and even just both physically and hormonally. So sexism
on a bell curve.
So sexism, descriptively, I'll keep on quoting this, makes a lot more sense why there's sexism in societies than racism, right? From an evolutionary perspective, and I don't mean sexism. I mean gender.
But again, the evidence that we have suggests that this division of labor based on sex happens later. We first are operating as a unit, as Neanderthals, as ancient, non-human, but human ancestors.
Yeah.
So as much as we retroactively apply logic to it to make it make sense and say why this should exist, the logic we apply is not necessarily congruent with the evolutionary history that we see. Now, that being said, it becomes complicated. How do we parse out the reason that differences exist? And going back to the physics example, I think while there is no question that if you are one of the few females that are at this conference, that presents as a woman, especially if you are presenting, phenotypically as a, very dramatic, not dramatically, but completely embracing your feminine energy. Let's say you're wearing
blonde, but
right, yeah. You choose to wear a dress. You wanna, you put lipstick on. You make yourself look beautiful because you're a woman, and that's what you want to do, and that's how you express your womanhood. Then it's all the worse for it. Usually, that does not mean though that we can, as a society, say, "Bam, this." Department should be 50% women and 50% men, and we need to retroactively create that. I don't think it works that way. For starters, there is these bell curves where some people lean to one interest and others lean to another interest. And I think that this idea that everything is equally of Rainier.
She's really exciting. And
she agrees.
And I will say she is a female dog and exhibiting very aggressive tendencies right now. So
the challenge that we have as a society is to make space that allows men who want to be, go to ballet and women who want to be physicists or whatever stereotype you want to go, to have space that welcomes that and lets it happen without prescribing it.
Yes, so I think we're saying the exact same. So
yes.
just to complete the circle here, and then one more question about trans, and then we'll move into anti-Semitism. I don't know how long you have, but
I'm here. I'm happy to go. Yes,
perfect. We can hang out here. This is good. I feel like podcasts. It's funny because when I'm recording on Zoom, I feel like around the 45-minute mark, I'm like, all right, I got to wrap this up. But this feels a lot more like casual. This is the conversation I feel like we've had this on like 6 different Shabbat dinners, but just the 5-minute version about this. So I think we're saying essentially the same thing, just from the other angle. You are talking proscriptively, which I totally agree with you, that how great is it now that we have a society that if a man wants to do ballet, that is accepted as mostly great, right? I mean, you'll still probably be ridiculed a little bit, which is bad, but mostly people would say, oh, that's just like what this guy wants to do. Yet still, in terms of 17-year-olds that do ballet, there's going to be more females on average, which seems to be more now that the choice is mostly a 50, now that there's no societal barriers.
Less societal barriers, sure. It seems like it makes sense that there's still going to be fewer men because of just... Totally.
Yeah. Okay.
And the only thing I'll add to this is I think that as a society we should be a little bit open-minded, and that there's a degree some of these things are an experiment. We actually might not know what the divide is. If we could magically just say there's no sexism in physics, which to be clear, I'm not convinced could ever happen.
Yeah.
We do not know what the demographic makeup of that would look like.
Sure. One of the interesting examples, I'm just saying, I'm a big rock climber, and actually rock climbing is an interesting sport where there is a very small gender gap between men and women. At the elite level of rock climbing, it's actually crazy. Okay, so the top maybe 20 rock climbers in the world right now are males, but in the top 50 there are some females, and the great thing about rock climbing is, there's a rock, it's objective, right? Everybody can go try this boulder, there's an objective grade that's basically, a consensus, and there are women that have climbed some of the hardest things in the world that only 10 men in the world can climb, and so it is very interesting that there it does become a lot more even. And there, again, it's hard to say that there's any societal barrier in, it's the same rock.
Well, and what's also really interesting in that is biologically, from a physiology of movement perspective, rock climbing is incredibly nuanced. You cannot isolate one skill set. It's not just endurance. Yeah. It's not just brute strength. It's not just flexibility. You actually kind of need all of these physiological strengths to rock climb, in which case it makes perfect sense, and you kind of have to be in a spectrum where you can wield those physiological traits.
100%. No, I mean, just the differences in, on average, how the top men in the world climb and how the top women in the world climb. I mean, the women, it literally looks like they're doing like a mixture of yoga and ballet. some of the foot placements seem impossible, and a lot of the top men, again, not all of them, are just, the rah,
Well, I mean, it's, and men and women, our bones are literally in different structures. The way our elbows bend is different. Our shoulder structures have variations. So, of course there's differences. But that's an amazing, I love this fun fact. I'm going to remember
Yeah,
this.
please.
Yes.
So, okay, going back to trans identity, we had a whole digression of the evolution there, but I think it's good. So you mentioned before, I wrote this down on my notebook that Rainier started chewing, so you had mentioned, I'm forgetting the exact quote, but you said, gender dysphoria leads to a lot of mental health issues. So one, even just the term gender dysphoria already seems to medicalize it in a way that I think a lot of people would find uncomfortable. So I guess from a layperson perspective, or do all trans people have gender dysphoria? I mean, because it's very confusing there.
This is a fantastic conversation. There is this tension that I have within me, and I think this. I would argue that this is a tension that others in the LGBTQ community experience, but I can't speak for everyone. But within my being, I hold this tension because I can acknowledge that the gender dysphoria, this deep feeling that your body is wrong, which is really any dysphoria, but in gender dysphoria, it's specific to your gender, is really a crippling phenomenon. Mm-hmm. Now, I also can acknowledge that I have deep concerns in our society about the pathologizing of the trans identity, which is to say, I think that making the trans identity a solely medical issue is a double-edged sword that is dangerous and at times suggests that being trans is a disease that needs treatment. And I think that the left is grappling with this right now because on one hand, we want to make sure that people who are non-binary and trans, and of course, lesbian and gay and bisexual, have access to healthcare, and there's been much discrimination within healthcare. On the other hand, in dogmatically demanding that healthcare is required, that certain things are required if you are trans, it suggests that it is a disease to be treated sort of in its messaging. And I would argue that neither are completely true and neither are completely wrong, like false. There's some balance in that. And you see it in different cultures. I mean, I think back to let's bring in Jewish gender.
Yes, okay. We can go Jewish. So, even Rainier is excited for the Jewish.
The rabbis in their ancient wisdom, and Rabbi Daniel, please correct me.
Listen, I've been I guess I'll use a progressive term. I've been mansplaining your entire field to you for the last hour. You can say whatever you want about Judaism.
So there are quite a few genders that have been delineated in Talmud, I believe, by ancient rabbinic scholars. And and part of the reason for this is that in Judaism we have very clear laws, at least that in ancient times, and particularly if you're Orthodox, and even in some conservative circles, delineate roles for male and female people. Yeah. Now, at the time, though, that led rabbis to say, what do we do with these people who are so clearly in between? Yeah. And so rabbis laid out various names for people who were, if you were born female but you had masculine traits naturally, if you were born female and you had masculine traits artificially, and vice versa. If you were born male and you had feminine traits artificially, and then they had other names if you were totally non-binary. Yeah. And so it meant to give these people a space in society, particularly within Jewish law. Now, how the extent to which this was actually appreciated within Jewish society is a probably longer conversation to the extent of that it is not, or it has not been historically. But nonetheless, it was a concept that we were talking about 2,000 years ago.
Sure. And also, I mean, the rabbis imagine Adam as actually being both male and female. And this is actually from, Ha'adam, but also, the Hebrew, it says, Zachar nekeva bara otam, right? There's very weird language. If for listeners that have no idea what we're talking about at this point, look up Genesis 2 and 3, because it talks about the creation of humanity a couple of different times, and some of the verse structure makes no sense. And actually, Plato also has this, the myth of the androgynous, which is very similar to Adam and Eve, this sort of primordial being that actually in Plato's case had like 16 I forgot the exact numbers, and then, they were too powerful, so the gods split them into multiple. So you definitely had this idea. I don't remember what that was in response to. But.
So as we talked about gender in society, and then
gender dysphoria. So I guess the follow-up question is, and this conversation is so hard because there are people on the right generally motivated by Christianity, but also some of it just, I don't know, a sort of non-empathetic right that almost wants to ridicule people that are obviously having the difficult situation of having gender dysphoria. The other question is more that, okay, well, if somebody has, I'm trying to pick a non-controversial example, but, we'll go controversial, might as well. If somebody has body imaging issues, and somebody either thinks that they're not pretty enough, or too skinny, or too fat, or, whatever the thing might be, some other dysmorphia there, the treatment would not be to say, you're right, let's make sure you don't eat again, or let's make sure you throw up after your food. So there is a critique of
the use of the word.
The use of the word, I think both from the anti-trans right, and also from, I can imagine, the trans community, because if I hear gender dysphoria, in my head it's, oh my God, this is a phenomenon that we need to basically figure out. Like, we have to do research. Why are so many people having this thing called gender dysphoria? If someone has it, you treat them, I would never go to somebody who has body imaging issues, and if they think that they are 2X, I would never say, no, you're not, or yes, you are, right? Like, I'm stepping,
right.
However you need to be taken care of, I'm going to do that. But then when you go to the psychiatrist or whatever, the psychiatrist is not going to say, yes, you're right, you are exactly how you imagine. The psychiatrist is going to say, here are some tools, let's make sure how to, how can you stop being, let's say anorexic or bulimic or all these. And what seems to, I think, confuse a lot of people about this issue is it's sort of trying to do both. It almost wants the best of both at the same time.
There is a messaging struggle within the LGBT community that we haven't really acknowledged as a community, because I think people that support us that don't understand what we're saying don't. That people
she always comes at the best parts.
People who support the LGBT community, and in particular their trans community, if they're confused, many of them are scared to even say anything, okay? And on the flip side, when you're in the LGBT community, we sometimes operate a little bit as a bubble. We are very close-knit. We go to our, we have terminology in our own community and culture that can be, really amazing. But the truth is, you are correct. To be trans, you do not have to experience gender dysphoria, and that would be the LGBTQ perspective. Okay. I don't know what the diagnostic perspective is, and I don't really, there's an inherent issue in medicalizing it in that way, because it suggests a pathology. It suggests that you're experiencing dysphoria, and then the word, like you said, dysphoria, implies different treatment than what we would prescribe.
But it sort of is, so I guess just to, and I slowly do want to talk about, Jews in the LGBT community, or maybe we'll have to do a whole follow-up episode if you tell me you're getting tired.
We'll do 2 parts, and yeah.
Exactly. The whole debate about, and this is, I'm forgetting the congressman's name that I opened with, Seth Moulton, maybe Moulton. I should have, done some.
Might have to, yeah.
I should have done some basic background research before this conversation, at least about this contemporary issue. If, let's say, under insurance or healthcare bills or things like that, a gender reassignment surgery should be covered under normative healthcare, which is, I guess, a big question. That does imply that it is something medical, and you need a diagnosis, because otherwise, why should taxpayer money under Medicare pay for surgery? Now that's fine. I'm happy to, people should be able to get whatever surgery, but there's a difference between me getting a surgery because of appendectomy than it is getting a nose job, right? A nose job is purely aesthetic. If I look into the mirror and I say, yeah, I would love it if my nose was a little bit different, then I would feel like my real self and I wouldn't be embarrassed to go out in public. That's a very different thing than if I need this thing because, my well-being depends on it. And so is gender reassignment surgery or even hormonal treatment, is it closer to the nose job or is it closer to the appendectomy? And if it's closer to the appendectomy, then there should be medical research talking about, well, why is this coming up in the first place? Because if there can be medical research, if I'm getting a tumor removed, I would hope there are some researchers saying, how do we stop more tumors? It's not saying if somebody has a tumor, you don't shun them and you don't say, oh, haha, you have a tumor, of course, which is what the right seems to do. But the question is more, it seems like now almost the medical community is too afraid to do research on why are there so many new trans people. And so it almost just seems like the movement seems so internally dogmatic. And I guess I'm coming at this from the only time I've really engaged with this community is when I took Intro to Gender Studies at UCLA, and this is 10 or 11 years ago.
Okay.
And I just remember, I've always been inquisitive and critical, and this was actually right at a time in my life that I was starting to question the Orthodox community, which to me was the big inflection point of my life, going from very dogmatic to, at least I think now, open-minded and willing to talk to anyone about anything. And I was sort of like right at the end of that. And I took this class, and I'm always an inquisitive person, and I was an even more inquisitive student. And so I remember going to office hours consistently to both the TA and also the professor, and trying to ask again, I probably didn't formulate it as,
but genuine questions.
But genuine questions of
not malice.
I don't really get this philosophy, this just doesn't, questions of gender and sex or questions of evolution that I was asking you. And I'm not saying they have to agree with me, but it was almost explicitly a couple of grad students just said I'm being transphobic and said, okay, I'm not going to talk to you. And the professor basically didn't really want to engage with it. I'll send you an article, and then sent me an article basically calling me transphobic. and so, and this is sort of consistent with what I've at least seen online and just heard about in the random culture war. Now, again, I don't really have a dog in this fight. I'm not, I'm very masculine. I present masculine. I've never had any question that I'm a man. So, to me, this whole conversation is just, interesting because it's, taking up so much space in the culture war. And I do see, I guess one other thing I'll add, obviously people get very hurt by it. And so there is a general, I think, human rights question that I have of, this is a very important question because depending on who's right about this, right, if this is some medical thing that's happening either from, let's say, endocrine disruptors or higher rates of anxiety because of social media or just general, I don't know, or, pesticide, whatever the things are that could be causing this, if this is causing 10% of the population to have these body imaging issues that then, have these deeply complicated questions of, do you go on, puberty blockers at 12 and you get that surgery when you're at 18? If it is some fundamental question, then it seems immoral to not look into it. On the other hand, if this is a question of, no, actually, this is their true identity, and, if you don't accept their true identity, you're just not letting them live out who they really are, there's a huge immorality to not doing that. But the question is, we don't know, and everyone's too afraid to talk about it.
I'd argue that what it means to accept someone's true identity is not clear. And does accepting someone's true identity mean that we support, every 12-year-old who wants, who identifies different should go on hormone blockers? Or does that mean they have the option to, but it's labeled experimental because we don't really know the effects and it comes with warnings? So I think some of the dogmatic responses within our community tell you that there's one way to be an ally. And that's part of the confusion, is that what that means that way to be an ally actually looks different for different people.
I had a psychiatrist tell me, a friend of mine, she's studying in residency, I won't say her name for obvious reasons, and she told me, this is about a year ago, that she thinks the hormone or the puberty blocker industry, she thinks it's going to be a second opiate crisis in 10, 15 years. Which was a very stunning thing for me to hear from a psychiatrist, because she said, and I'll just, finish it and then let you respond. She said that everybody, I mean, this is her words, not mine, everybody, all of her colleagues sort of know this is crazy what they're doing, but everyone's too afraid to say anything because, the backlash is
And I do want to talk about this because I first of all, I also, the U.S. has taken a different path in this conversation than the European. So the United States Pediatric Society has sort of done a blanket statement of we will provide medical care for trans youth. Okay, and that's, again, I am not at all saying we should not be providing medical care. It's just the question from an evidence-based standpoint of what is the medical care that best supports our trans youth community. And the evidence that puberty blockers are the right way to go, the safe way to go, and the way that's going to help mental health the most is just not really there. But
isn't there also, I guess, just in the question of, right, okay, so you also have a question of, let's just say cancer, because, Shayna, my wife, is studying to be a cancer surgeon, so it's just a field that I've spent a lot of time around and reading about just out of peripheral interest, right? So cancer rates are rising among young people, right? So more 30-year-olds now are getting colon cancer than that was true 40 years ago. So there is this question of, there's sort of two questions. We're coming up with novel treatments of colon cancer. Is it surgery? Is it, these drugs? Like, whatever. So there could be a good debate or a healthy debate about if somebody comes in with colon cancer and they're healthy enough to undergo this extensive surgery, what is the best way to treat them, right? That's question number one. But there's a more important question to some extent, assuming you don't have colon cancer already, which is, why are so many 30-year-olds getting colon cancer now more than 30 years ago? The answer is obviously the food we eat, the pesticides, just everything in modern life that's sort of, coming together in conjunction to make people less healthy than 50 years ago. It's no fault of the individual, of course. It's just this, I don't want to call it a conspiracy, but, there's a lot of societal forces working against people in terms of food and, pesticides and all these things. So almost a similar question when it comes to trans identity. If a 12-year-old says to their parents or their school counselor or whoever, I feel like I'm not a X, I feel like I'm a Y, there's two levels of a question that for me. One is, what do you do, right? Once that person says that.
Okay.
That's a tricky question. I don't have any clue what the answer is, right? But I'm not even so interested in that answer. What I'm interested in, why are more 12-year-olds than ever before saying that? And I suspect the answer is a little bit richer than we just don't know yet because we don't have the experimental research. This is an interesting question. I think that this is one of the reasons these are hard conversations is because we have to be careful about how we talk about it. It's similar to when we describe autism rates. There is we have two truths, which, and again, in the trans community, this is kind of difficult because we have pathologized it. So the truth is that there is treatment for it. And the same statement is true about autism. We have pathologized it and there's treatment for it. But at the same time, it's also true that there's nothing wrong with people who are autistic and there's nothing wrong with people who are trans, and they could live about their lives without treatment if society were different, supposedly. So those are the two camps that exist. And it's kind of hard to hold both of those truths at the same time in a society that's as medicalized as we are. But I actually think, I'm not to push back against you, because I know that you're just sort of reflecting the consciousness of two different communities. I actually think the average person thinking about this squarely agrees with both of those. Like, I think most people, right, thinks, one, if somebody is trans, they should be treated with, of course, equal respect. I mean, the tenets of basic liberal democracy and, human dignity. You should call them whatever preferred pronoun they want, because, again, just basic dignity. If you told me that I all of a sudden want to be called, Lore instead of Lauren, even if I think Lore is a stupid, name, I would call, again, who am I to say, no, you don't want to be called that? I don't go by my legal first name. My legal first name is Moshe.
Right.
And so
in many ways, the Jewish community is very prepared for this.
Exactly, right? If you were to come up to me and you were to say, no, I'm only calling you Moshe, I mean, I wouldn't, that would just be
It would just be weird.
It would just be like,
Nobody
it would just be
gets
like,
that.
you'd just be being a dick, right? So, like,
Jews have
same
many
thing,
names.
so whatever the reason that I don't go by Daniel, that I don't go by Moshe and go by Daniel, that's irrelevant to if I say, hey, can you please call me Daniel?
Right.
You should call me Daniel, right? So, same thing with
Basic
the trans
respect.
community, and I would guess the vast majority, I've never really met somebody that was so radical on this issue that if they were face to face with somebody who said, hey, use he pronouns with me as opposed to she, no, I refuse, right? So,
I mean, they definitely exist.
Of course,
I do think they are
exist.
in the. I think they do not make up the majority, and
yes.
I would agree that is.
On the flip side, I also think the vast majority of Americans are walking around, tiptoeing around this issue, saying, there seem to be a lot more people identifying as trans. Again, when someone identifies as trans, all these values that I just said apply. But, like, why? What is happening here? Is there something that society's doing? Is this something, again, I've heard it called social contagion. Contagion is, again, medicalized. But even, I'll use, is this a social thing that if it happens to a couple people in a group, there's a bigger chance of other people? Does this have to do with earlier onset puberty among girls, which is something that's very well documented? So I think the vast majority of Americans would kind of say both of those things and say, I'm even too afraid to have, where I think, the Democrats or progressives go wrong, is they put up this, these gatekeepings in the way that they talk about this that makes it so that even just having this conversation, I'm sure if certain people listen to this, they think, oh my God, you had a conversation with a bigot. But the problem is the majority. No, I'm saying me as the bigot. Yeah. But the vast majority of the country, I think, probably has. It's probably even more to the right on this than I am, to be honest.
Well,
and so, just nothing's happening in terms of...
So, two things. So, as I regularly have two statements. So, to loop around, I do want to go back to the U.S. Pediatric Society, because I think it speaks to this scaredness to have this conversation from a perspective of evidence-based practice in the United States, which is to say that the recommendations from our Pediatric Society is different than the European Union. The European Union offers caution with puberty blockers, and they're not convinced it's safe because the data isn't there. And we see this in the US with many things. I mean, we see this in our food. They say, oh yes, this food coloring is totally fine. Just kidding, it might not be. Oh yes, titanium dioxide, totally fine in Skittles. California says, just kidding, it's not. So there is a different, perspectives, but we are scared to have this conversation, and it's in part, I think, because of some of the dogma that's around, and it's in part because on both the far left and the far right, we have stopped talking to each other altogether.
But I'm going to pin this more on the far left, because the far right has always had a problem with any LGBT identity, right? But they've lost that debate, right?
They lost it in response to the far left going, right? The far left came in response to that.
Yes, yes.
So it's, that's a chicken and an egg.
100%. But the question about gay rights, I mean, again, there are homophobes for sure in the country, but, it is stunning to see how quick that shifted. I mean, we were both reflecting on this. Obama in 2008
was
explicitly said in the debate, with the primary debate with Hillary, in 2007, they had a debate and somebody asked them, and both Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama
were not,
basically said, no, of course we're not going to legalize gay marriage, and then, a couple years later it signed, federal protection. So the right is just upset that they lost it, and, the right is sort of moved from, at least how I'm seeing things, being controlled more by this, fundamental Christian. Of course, the fundamentalist Christians are all still there, but more, the right is very good at capitalizing on social issues that make the left seem stupid.
Totally.
And this just happens to be one of the best examples. And again, if you look at a lot of, election diagnoses of what just happened in the election, almost every article does include some line about, Trump's attack ad on Kamala Harris for the transgender reassignment surgeries for inmates.
So let's break that down. I want to put a pin in coming back to...
I'll write it. I'll write it down.
Please write it down. And coming back to...
Because I did steal the pen that I gave you.
Mine was stopping working, and Rainier chewed your other one, which is why I giggled earlier. So I want to come back to this concept of whether or not, more about how questioning why are there more trans individuals that identify that way today. Let's come back to that. You'll just remember with our ADHD combined, it'll happen. But so Trump's attack, for starters, there's a degree that it is, an interesting statement on human society. But his attack, if I recall correctly, was very specific to something that Kamala said in her first run in the primaries 4 years ago, that was saying Democrats are going to spend your money giving gender reassignment surgery to felons who are not who are illegal immigrants. Okay. Yeah. And the truth is, this never has happened.
This is like a Talmudic case.
Yeah,
if you have a cow that has 2 heads and then has 3 offspring, how do you tell which? It's like.
Now, I've read various articles about this as well, and I think that the takeaway from this is that it triggered something that Americans have a very strong sense of fairness. And we as a country are economically hurting. We have people that are economically hurting from grocery bills, from medical bills, and the concept of spending, tens of thousands of dollars on someone who isn't even an American citizen, who is a felon, and who is, on top of all of that, getting a surgery that many Americans view as elective, is really, I think, resonated in the minds of a lot of people because Democrats have focused their energy at times on small portions of people and unfortunately also in the process ignored the working class.
Yeah, I think
and so it's rang true for people.
That's a great broad diagnosis. I think the only thing I would add is I think specifically on some of these culture war issues, I think there was an additional thing of the mainstream American thinking the far left has just gone so crazy on some of these issues.
We become so dogmatic.
Listen, I think support for Hamas is another that we haven't even gotten into, but I think,
it absolutely relates to this.
But it's just like the same type of thinking of, this is so black and white, so, no pun intended, but so binary in terms of, our view is the right one, and everyone who disagrees are these immoral
Which is ironic coming from a community that wants to remove the binary.
But it's not. But the progressives, hardcore progressives, or far left. I don't know if you identify as a progressive, but I'll say far left.
I'm your mainstay liberal.
Mainstay liberal. Okay. Mainstay liberal. So I would still, I guess, begrudgingly consider myself a mainstay liberal. But progressives just seem to stake out such black and white positions on the world, and this seems to be one of those, and they've created systems both in the university and also media and things in pop culture where any dissent from that mainstream narrative is met with public humiliation and canceling and, all these things.
Absolutely.
And the average American, I think, one of the big polls in this election was, here you have Trump, who's like the crudest public figure to maybe exist in, maybe American history, in terms of bucking all norms and social norms and racism and, misogyny and all of this. And a lot of people are almost choosing between, like, the elitist progressive having to tiptoe around any tough conversations and the guy who's like so crude that he'll say whatever he wants. And I think a lot of Americans
100%.
Almost said, like, well, maybe I don't love Trump, but at least he's willing to, like, stick it to the establishment that's going to, be canceling me for saying whatever. Rainier's getting really excited here.
Rainier's trying to eat our notes.
See, the trick is when I do recording on Zoom, I can have some food in my hand and just kind of continuously throw it throughout so Rainier doesn't show on camera. Here it's a little bit harder because she sees us having so much fun and wants to get involved. But I think that's the issue with the far left on the whole trans conversation, which makes it really hard to even have a conversation. I just don't even see the average person just isn't even really, they don't feel like they're even allowed to have a conversation about this, but yet of course they all are, so.
It's very interesting. I will say that I have quite a few friends from back home, from Virginia where I grew up, Northern Virginia, and here, and really all over that are not in the queer community and are often scared to talk to me. They are genuinely...
I just said this. Yeah. I was talking to Yehuda Price, who is a black man, And I got a really interesting comment. I just published it yesterday. We're recording now. It's Monday at, 4:40 p.m. So just yesterday, he was talking about how it's, super important to talk to whomever. And I mentioned that I think the focus on microaggressions a couple years ago made a lot of people too afraid to talk to different people. And this is exactly the point, because I can see a lot of people, I've heard students tell me this verbatim, when somebody walks into Hillel and they don't present as something obvious, right? I think trans is or non-binary is sort of the obvious one. And people being even so afraid to say hi and introduce you to the group, because what happens if they say he as opposed to she?
Yep.
And so it's, you walk in and it's, oh my God, I can't. And they think what they're doing is being progressive, or at least they're operating in a progressive milieu that is, if, the worst thing you can do is a microaggression, which is accidentally misgendering you, not on purpose, not to be an asshole, but from my perspective, the worst thing I can do to you is not acknowledge your individuality and humanness. If you walk into the room, I want to come up and say, it's great to see you, Shabbat Shalom, what's your name? I'm Daniel, oh, this is David, great to meet, oh, David, can you tell?
Yeah.
And then sometimes I'll even guess, if I'm operating on autopilot, sometimes I'll even say, hey, David, can you tell them where the food is? And maybe you very much don't identify as a them, you identify as she. Okay, I'm willing to take that risk to not be an asshole and ignore you. And most people appreciate that,
right.
I would guess, in the trans community.
Yes.
But
I can't speak for the whole trans community. But in general, the non-binary community for sure, and in my experience with, many of my friends who are trans, it is a relief to be asked, how do you identify? And of course there's a most...
Which could be a microaggression.
Well,
if you walk into a room and you present as non-typical male or female, and I say, how do you identify? And let's say the person next to you is clearly identifying as a male, there might be a world in which you get mad at me and you say, what do you mean? Why are you just asking?
In fact,
so this is why
the non-binary community and trans community actually differ, I think, at times in this response. And I can't say this always. I can't even say this is a bell curve. There are trans individuals that I know that actually fall on that spectrum where they don't really like being asked that question. They don't actually volunteer their pronouns.
Yeah, I'm still listening. I'm just going to get this out of Rainier's mouth.
Rainier, who has decided to eat the notebook.
Eat the notebook.
But it's interesting because there are, the way people respond to that may be different. And I think that the vast majority of my fellow LGBTQ community does not respond in anger or accusations. There is no question that there is a subset who do. It has made dialogue incredibly difficult.
But it just seems like almost such an obvious point. I had a situation a couple of years ago where I went to a funeral for a friend's dad at a church. And I was wearing a kippah. It was actually a really interesting internal debate. Should I wear a kippah? Should I not? I wore a kippah in a church. Yes, with all the interesting caveats. And it was clear people were staring at me. And at a certain point, I was thinking to myself, I probably shouldn't have worn. I wasn't trying to prove anything. I honestly don't even think about it much. I put on my kippah and go. And someone came up to me afterwards. It was like a lunch reception or something afterwards, and asked, I'm a little bit afraid to ask this, but I'm curious, like, how you feel being in a church as a Jew. And no one else came up to me to talk to me during lunch. Right. And in my head, I was like, oh, thank God, someone's talking to me. I was like, I'm going to eat the poor lunch alone. I came to be nice. And, like, what a great question. Oh, you're right. I was thinking about it. It's very interesting. Here's what I was considering. And at no point did I think, oh, my God, this is a microaggression. And so I can't imagine if you're in the, whatever community. Now, again, there's obviously going to be some Jews who, if they're wearing a kippah even, they get offended if somebody asks, but
the vast majority.
Exactly. Yes. Most people just want to, be normal.
And so there's a degree that media on both the left and the right has amplified these fringe voices. On the right, you see this amplification of demonization of people that get it wrong, ruining traditional gender roles, all of these things that aren't really true. And on the left, what we see sometimes is this real heavy emphasis on, the one professor out of 100 who is incredibly transphobic. And it doesn't mean that that professor doesn't exist, but there's a hyperfixation, and the rate at which those professors exist can vary quite significantly. But at the end of the day, they're not the majority. Now, of course, I will say and acknowledge that I'm saying this from the comfortable state of California, and I have also lived in Idaho, and the reality of LGBTQ folks who live in deep red states in the middle of this country is quite different than us who are on the coast. You know?
Sure. But it seems like, or not but, because I think that's an important point, it seems like the LGBTQ community is almost more extreme in the coasts.
Oh, I mean, it absolutely is.
So I'm thinking of like, I don't see, let's say San Francisco, at a lot of the LGBTQ, or pride parades, this is all, things that I've read, let's say having any type of Jewish identity or having an Israeli, or a Magen David, a Jewish star at pride, a lot of people are sort of afraid to have because it's, you can't be pro-LGBT community and, a Zionist, or, there's these
afraid
purity
would be
tests.
Putting it nicely.
Yeah, right? You have these purity tests and, okay, so even more so, me as, again, like, let's be honest, I present as a very typical standard male with all the normal, masculine types of, I'm loud, I talk a lot, I'll push back if I disagree, and I think I'm also pretty nice. I did make you coffee an hour ago.
Daniel just described myself.
There we go. Perfect. So to me it's almost funny, because for me to have a real relationship with somebody as an individual, I actually need to be able to have interesting, tough conversations about, even discussions and arguments.
How very Jewish of you.
The thing that would actually keep me from having any trans friends would be LGBTQ friends would be specifically if I felt like I couldn't have these conversations. Like, that's when things are bad, right? Like, because I'm never gonna, I'm just inquisitive by nature, so if I see something that I don't understand, I want to, ask questions about it. Right. I think that's, we're both pretty nerdy people, so
100%.
That's, so to me, it's almost the whole fixation on misgendering and microaggression. If somebody is not doing it intentionally, it just seems like it's backfiring at such strong levels, because it's like, then of course people are going to not want to interact with that person.
There is this concept of a lack of grace given from both sides. There is and that's I also a mild way of putting it, but on the left, we often assume the worst, and some of us that assume the worst are not even non-binary, we're not even trans, we're not even LGBTQ. There are, completely cis-het people that will go, on a hill to defend the trans community aggressively from people that they consider being transphobic. Mm. And sometimes that person might be being transphobic. But sometimes in my opinion, and again, I don't necessarily identify as trans, but within the LGBT community, it doesn't really look phobic at all. It just looks like someone's asking a question. And so sometimes you see, and I think we also see that on the left with white saviors. There are, if you look at the far left progressives, they are the least diverse sect in the Democratic Party. They are overwhelmingly white.
Even people, they polled the Latino community about the term Latinx.
Exactly.
85% of Latinos are like, we hate this term.
And 100.
It's actually funny, because a couple of years ago, I remember the first year that I taught at UCI, so this is now 4 years ago, there was a student in my class who is, quite progressive. I talked to them over the quarter, and at one point they came up to me during office hours, and they very innocently asked me if saying that somebody's Jewish is a slur. And I was like, well, what do you mean? And she was like, well, if I was going to describe you, I wouldn't say, oh, he's Jewish. I would say he practices Judaism, because I was told by a friend of mine, probably in a progressive circle, saying he's Jewish is offensive and a microaggression. And I told her, I'm like, actually, listen, it's interesting, because not all Jews practice Judaism,
Right.
right? There's a differentiation, and, listeners to my podcast are aware of this dynamic and this split between, Jewish and practicing Judaism. And I was like, of course you can say somebody, again, if you say he's a Jew, and then, you're spitting,
right.
Of course that's not great, but of course describing someone as Jewish is fine. But because she was so attuned to microaggression, she was actually completely misunderstanding Jewish identity.
Correct.
And so this to me has always been, the interesting example that I give here, because it was so clear that, this type of extreme gatekeeping is just going to make it harder for, again, the ultimate goal, at least that I have as a liberal, you also described yourself as a liberal, is like, let's get to a point in society where everybody treats each other as individuals, again, to add the religious component, created in the image of God, that is infinitely important, and has value. And then, of course, fix whatever politics and society structures that are not doing that. Of course, there's important activism work to be done, but it's clear that to get to that goal, we have to be able to, talk to each other.
I wanna make a suggestion that some of this issue that we're seeing in the LGBT community about, being closed off to conversations, I'm not always convinced is coming from my full, the full community that I am part of. Which is to say that I think the loudest in the LGBTQ community are the progressive left. And the progressive left has a dogmatic set of ideals they live by. And if you disagree with one of them, it sometimes makes it difficult. And for example, if you're a Republican gay man or a Republican lesbian, I don't know how they could possibly interact with the LGBTQ community as it stands without getting completely ostracized. And that is a really sad statement about where we're at today. But it's come down to these deep dogmatic values that one after the other within the LGBT community, you agree with, it's a whole thing. You have to hate capitalism. You have to, think that Israel is the worst. You have to hate that male patriarchy. The way you view trans rights as, it's either not talked about, implicitly assumed, or everyone agrees that, that it is both a gender, both the dichotomies we talked about before, where it's both a medical necessity but not a pathology. And so if you fall out of line with one of those, it's not uncommon for someone in the LGBTQ community, in my experience, when I go there as a fellow queer human, to be like, well, wait a minute, that's not okay. Someone will quote unquote call me out on it because I am not presenting in the way that's supposed to. And of course, this is incredibly antithetical to academia, where we want discourse. It's antithetical to Jewish values, where we agree that arguing is a deep value. Having debate is a deep value. And
it's also it's the only way to get to truth. It just
100%.
seems like self-evident that the way to get to truth is not to shame people.
And it, in fact, makes it difficult to even say what everyone in your community thinks, because if we have a disagreement, I think many of us hold it close to our chest. And I will be honest, as a queer Jew, I have had a very difficult time in queer spaces, especially since October 7th. It really started after the skirmishes in 2021 in the spring. For me,
that was the Great March of Return. Just for listeners that aren't, Rainier is also, alerting us to the fact that, I don't know, there's probably some animal hanging out outside.
There's some animal.
If you hear barking in the background, Rainier is agreeing enthusiastically with you. She is not a member of the LGBT community, but is an ally, and has been very upset by, I'll say, anti-Semitism in those spaces. Just for listeners who are not familiar, the sort of, not really a precursor to October 7th, but in 2021, Hamas was sending people to the border. It was called the Great March of Return. There were some people breaching the border. The IDF responded in kind, arguably a little bit too hardly, but that's for, people to debate. And this was sort of one of the beginnings of the rampant anti-Semitism within the LGBTQ spaces, where, I think it was the Dyke March in Chicago.
The Dyke March was particularly bad.
Well, so the Dyke March, you could probably, know more, but this was, LGBT march in Chicago in 2017 2018. It was early.
Yeah, it was
This is
early.
even before the
It
Great
was even,
March.
yeah.
Where they basically explicitly said no Jewish stars.
Yeah.
And so they basically that was just fully anti-Semitism.
Well, and then you get these flags that are, that have arms and guns up in them, and they say no Zionists, and it's like, okay, so does that mean you're going to shoot me? What is that? What is that? How does that leave space for me? And it's become such, and there's many reasons why this is sad. And I have talked, I have quite a few friends who are of all ages who are Jewish and queer, and this sentiment of being incredibly isolated seems to ring true for many of my friends. And it's interesting because this theme that we feel is that the queer community was supposed to be our family. The queer community would told us that they would always be there for us and be our family when our families wouldn't. And that was a lie. And it was a blatant lie. And it is deeply distressing and hurtful that's true. And it turns out that the only community that was really there for us was the Jewish community. And was that every Jewish community? Of course not. There are fringe Jews that had their beliefs and whatever. But it was certainly far more of the Jewish community than it is of the queer community. I mean, I remain deeply uncomfortable going into queer spaces, and they used to be a space that I was the most comfortable in. And it's sad for two reasons. One, the queer space was supposed to be a space of safety for queer people first. And I'm not sure it is that anymore because you have to pass multiple litmus tests. You kind of have to be anti-capitalist. You kind of have to be progressive. You sure as hell can't be a Zionist. And sorry, I don't know if I'm allowed to curse, but I just did. And the other,
hell is cursing to you?
I don't know. I don't know what the 7 words were. I almost said word.
I was talking to Joe Walsh, who was a former congressman, and he dropped like 6 F-bombs on the podcast.
Fantastic.
So no, if Joe Walsh
so
do it, then
that great. But the other sad part is that it speaks to a growing trend within the queer community of attaching queer rights and queer civil rights and queer progress onto other movements. And the reason that is sad is because it's ultimately going to, in my opinion, delegitimize queer movements. It is really easy for our Republican Congress to dismiss the absolute need to have bathrooms that are safe for trans and non-binary kids, adults, congresswomen. I mean, this is a fundamental necessary right. And the same community that's asking for that is inviting, people who are on known terrorist lists to give talks at universities about how Israel is colonizing the world and pinkwashing the world. And it makes it unbelievably difficult to take this group seriously when they become so radicalized.
Pinkwashing, and that would have been a perfect place to end the podcast, but in my inquisitive nature, and maybe we'll just end with a little conversation. So just to define pinkwashing for listeners, the idea that Zionists or Israel talks about its good treatment of the LGBT community that supposedly defects from its treatment of Palestinians. To me, it's such a weird thing. There's a lot of things to fault Israel for, but to specifically fault Israel for its good record on the gay community, it just seems shocking. It's like, oh, if only Israel was more like other countries in the Middle East. It's like it just makes and this kind of gets into this whole progressive and gender conversation, because obviously the places that are the worst in the world, the treatment of both women and the LGBT community is the rest of the Arab world, right?
100, it's not even close.
Places like Afghanistan, the Taliban just passed a law: women can't speak in public. Iran,
it's draconian.
It's draconian. All these countries. Egypt that still has a female genital mutilation rate of 90%. Some crazy percent. And progressives that are supposedly care about the LGBT community or even feminism just don't say anything about these groups.
And I really do want to emphasize, sometimes I'll bring this up to other people and they'll say they'll make the argument that it's a whataboutism. And I'm going to tell you it's not, because I think we can talk about both. But part of the reason that it's not is because there is data. Like with everything, I am not simply we're not making this comment based on just opinion. It's really easy to look at the data. If you look at the sheer volume of media that comes out of Gaza and Israel, it pales in comparison. And what you can do is, I mean, there's various statistics that have looked at it, and they'll normalize it to like conflicts based on death toll. So they'll say for every person that died, one news report came out, or half a news report came out. Or 0.003, which is pretty common because the world has a lot of wars. In the Israel-Hamas conflict, it's something like 300 articles per person that has died. It's this extreme level of news coverage that pales in comparison to all other conflicts in the world. And at that point, when something is treated so differently from the rest of the world, it leads you to pause and say, why? And it goes again back to the same comment about the way we talk about the LGBTQ community in Israel. No, it's not perfect. It is absolutely not perfect. It's not perfect in the United States either. But good fucking God, it is so much better than any of the surrounding countries. It's not even close. You will not die. You will not get mutilated, and you can live and have a job in the highest ranks of society as a queer person. Now, there's questions about adoption, there's questions about marriage, but
we can do a whole episode. Yeah,
that's true for people who are non-Jewish and cis and het. It's a very complicated, but nonetheless, the bar is really low, and none of these other countries come close to passing it. And as a country, within our community, we give no shits.
Yeah, so I guess this is sort of, I guess, maybe the final thing that I'll say, which is I almost see the LGBTQ community's stance on trans the same way I see their stance on Israel, which is it's just so dogmatic and so not worth engaging with that almost just a full write-off of anything these fields have to say, which is a shame because I think that there could be a lot of good being done from these communities, both from a activist and a researcher. I'm including both, activists and also gender studies, field. There could be a lot of good coming out of this, but for whatever reason, they've morphed into such ideological, dogmatic fields where, gender studies just seems like the opposite of academia in the sense of academia is about critically asking questions. And, a lot of, left-wing fields have sort of been captured by this, more ideological type thinking. But nowhere, I think, is it more clear than, say, the treatment of Israel and Zionism. It could almost be a litmus test, I think, for how legit a field of academic study
100%.
is. Where ask, the average professor in that field, what do you think about Zionism? And if you get a eloquent answer full of nuance, that's probably a field worth listening to. And if you get they're anarcho-capitalist, white supremacist, colonialist society, it's probably they're not publishing much of value anyway.
I will push back. I don't think gender studies is inherently anti-academic. I think what it has turned into in many ways where you see, I think exploring roles of gender in society and roles has plenty of merit and worthy discussion. But what's happened in gender studies in academia, within gender studies and frankly within sociology, within many fields, is a dogmatic approach where the answer was determined and then evidence was found to support the answer, as opposed to, the classic scientific method where you go, or academic method where you go and explore and collect evidence and then determine what the evidence means.
Sure, but a staple of dogma is specifically that other way.
No, 100%. And so the dogma has absolutely really embedded itself within academia. And I guess my final thoughts would be that in my deep hope is that I hope, on the right, we can, there can be an embracing of the fact that people are different and have different needs, and that maybe that there are ways to talk about things that acknowledge the human a little bit more, because sometimes it's, we get so tied up in the economics and all these things that we forget the human. On the left, I really genuinely hope that we can have more space to acknowledge that people just like us are not perfect. We can, have more space to acknowledge that we are in an incredibly elitist bubble, and that elitist bubble isolates and, separates people. And to have the humility to know that we maybe don't know the right answer, but we know that something isn't right. We know that it's not right for people to, be suffering when there's medical care that could help them. We, however, do not know the best medical care for everything as it stands today. And so having room to discuss these conversations without assuming the worst intention from people, which is very challenging when the other side is also, accusing people of being snowflakes or other things. So there has to be this space where both sides can see the humanity of each other. And my encouragement for myself and for other listeners is to go be friends with someone who is on the other side of the political aisle as you. If you are a leftist and you don't have any friends who are at the very least center, at least some who are on the right, you are deeply missing out. And you are not just missing out, and this is true for the right. If you do not have friends who are in the center or on the left, you are missing out. And part of what you are missing out on is not just the full human experience of this country, which is, America, we are the most diverse country in the world. It's not even close. We are a unique country. There is no country that can, say the best course of action for everything. But to embrace that diversity, we have to look at all sides. That means white, Black, Asian, Latino, men, woman, non-binary, trans, all of it. And I would love to see a day where we could actually come and have these debates in a way that lets people actually say what they want to say, but defend it. And let people disagree with you, knowing that I might disagree, but I still believe in your humanity, and I would still fight for your humanity and your rights as a human vehemently.
That was beautiful. I don't even want to say anything to end off. So, Lauren, thank you so much. This is the longest podcast by far, but I think people are going to find this very interesting. So, thank you again.
Absolutely, it was wonderful to be here. Whew.
That was fun.
That was fun. I